As the director of the Latin American Center, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of our new academic year. Special welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Carlota Perez, who I will be introducing in a minute. A very special welcome as well to our students, those joining us this year and those starting the second year of their MPhil in Latin American Studies. And of course, a warm welcome to you all. So good to see so many friends in the center today. I feel, of course, sorry that we cannot have this lecture in person, as we traditionally do, but at the same time, glad to see that we are able to reach out through this revolutionary technology, paradoxes linked to the COVID-19 circumstances to which Professor Perez may refer to in her lecture. We have put again another exciting seminar program for this term, our main seminar series every Tuesday, the Coffee and Science series organized by our colleague Andresa de Sousa Santos, director of the Brazilian Studies Center, on Wednesday, starting next week. Our history seminar every Thursday, and the Latin American Center-based Research Network seminar on some Fridays. There are, of course, many other programs on Latin America in Oxford. There is, for example, a new Caribbean network being organized with the Oxford's Research Center in the Humanities Torch, to which LAC affiliates contribute, and they had their first event earlier this afternoon. And there will be a new seminar series on the Colombian peace process, which will start this Friday in Merton College. We will keep you posted on all these events through our Monday bulletin, the Latin American Oxford in Week this week. And if you know about any other events in Oxford, please let us know. Well, it is really a great pleasure to introduce our very special guest speaker, Professor Carlota Perez, and indeed, welcome her back to the Latin American Center. A researcher, academic, and international consultant, Carlota Perez studies the social and economic impact of technological change and the historical changing conditions for growth, innovation, development, and competitiveness. She is an honorary professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in UCL and at the University of Sussex. Author of the influential Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, The Dynamics of Bubbles and Golden Ages, published by Elgar in 2002, her career began in civil service. She was founding director of the technological development in Venezuela in the 1980s. As a consultant, she has worked for several Latin American governments, for multilateral organizations, and many global corporations. She recently chaired the European Commission's Horizon 2020 expert group for green growth and jobs. As academic in residence at Anthemis UK, her current research project, Beyond the Technological Revolution, analyzes the social shaping of technology and the historical role of the state in defining the context for innovation. Welcome, Professor Perez, as the inaugural lecturer of our academic year at the Latin American Center in Oxford. Carlota.
So we're going to talk about technological opportunities and the dynamic post-COVID future for Latin America. So I'm going to give you what I consider an optimistic view of the future. And I hope you will consider it so too. We're going to begin by the question that everybody is asking. The question that everybody has in their mind today is, what role can COVID-19 play in the development perspectives of Latin America? And I have an answer for that. And it's a very odd answer. I say that it's going to depend on the role COVID plays on how the information revolution is shaped in the advanced world. This means, first of all, that information revolutions are shaped. They don't just shape us. And the second thing it means is that we really depend on what happens in the advanced world. We can do many things. It's not that we depend totally. I don't believe that the dependency theory is this very, very rigid thing. But our opportunities actually come from whatever happens in the advanced world. So what I am going to hold is that opportunities for development are a moving target, which is defined by the phases of evolution of global capitalism. So there is a pattern to how capitalism evolves, how it absorbs technological revolutions, and the phase in which they are determines the possibilities that we have. So, of course, this means that in my terms, it's important to identify the specific opportunities in order to be able to take advantage of them. So the talk will have 4 parts. We'll begin by looking at this pattern of diffusion of technological revolutions that I was talking about and the opportunities it opens and closes. Then we'll look at the opportunity, the current opportunity for Latin America in the second globalization, which it might surprise you. It's about new technologies and natural resources. Then we will talk about the type of strategy that could serve the purposes of taking advantage of that opportunity. And finally, we will look at the fact that post-COVID reconstruction could be the moment at which we can make the leap. So let's begin with the theoretical part. How do technological revolutions evolve? What types of phases do they go through? So there have been 5 technological revolutions in the past 240 years. The first one was the Industrial Revolution, machines, factories, canals. The second one, the age of steam, coal, iron, and railways. Basically, those 2 were in England, in the UK, and a little bit of Europe. Then Germany and the US forge ahead and actually take off and get ahead of Britain. It's the age of steel and heavy engineering, electrical, chemical, civil, naval. And it was also the first globalization. That is the time when the whole of the Southern Hemisphere was incorporated into the global economy. And that included, of course, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, the whole lot. Australia, New Zealand. And at the same time, there were the advancing countries, the forging ahead. So it's a globalization as impressive as this one, and maybe at the time even more impressive. Then we have the 4th revolution, the age of the automobile, oil, petrochemicals, and mass production, which took most of the 20th century, and is the one we are still having to face the consequences of. Today, we are in the age of information technology and telecommunications. And I want you to note that the arrow is halfway, because that is exactly what I hold, that the age of information technology is only halfway along, and that in fact, the golden age is still to come. And what could come after that? Well, the 6th revolution is very likely to be some combination of biotech, bioelectronics, nanotechnology, and new materials, because every technological revolution is actually in gestation while the other one is proceeding and, of course, takes off when the other one is exhausted. So, for instance, the automobile was invented 30 years before Henry Ford made it affordable. Computers were invented 30, 40 years, and the internet was also invented in the 50s and 60s. And it only really became available to everybody in the 90s. So revolutions come together at a particular point, precisely mostly when the previous one is exhausted, but they actually are in gestation throughout the previous revolution. And that's important to understand for reasons that you will see in a minute. So different sets of opportunities open or close as diffusion proceeds. And they radically change with each revolution. Not only do they change because of the phase of the diffusion, but they also change because of the nature of the revolution. So let's look at the historical pattern. We begin the early years, the early decades of each revolution, I have called installation. And that's the time when the new technology is installed, but the previous one is still there. And it's mature and it's declining, but it's still there. So there is this battle. So it's a period of intense experimental innovation, which Schumpeter called of creative destruction. It's a time of elimination and replacement of jobs, of skills, of industries and products. So it's a very painful time for lots. All the inequality we're going through are the result of the installation period of the information revolution. And there is the polarization of income, and we have financial bubbles and collapses. In fact, every revolution has its bubbles, and when it collapses comes something that can be called a turning point recession. The moment when we go from the installation period, which is this very difficult experimental thing with a lot of polarization, to what I will now describe as the golden ages. So the turning point is a time that comes after the collapse of the bubbles. It's when destruction is revealed. It's very visible. There is resentment as fertile ground for populism. So we now have lots of populists all over the world. We used to have in the 1930s, which was the previous turning point, we had fascism and communism as the two offers at the two extremes. There is division in political parties, emergence of new movements, like we now have the Green Movement and all others, because people are unhappy. You see the whole conditions of that recessive turning point when things have to change. And yet there is a huge technological potential. In the 1930s, the whole of the mass production revolution was already there. It just had to be deployed. So we get the gold for innovation with a new potential. We have a change in lifestyles, which is very important because changes in lifestyles are what creates the new jobs. So the lifestyle of the suburbanization, the suburban American way of life of the 1950s and 60s, which is still with us, and it's still being copied by the Chinese and the others, everybody who's coming in. That created all the jobs that mass production was eliminating. Created enough, it even created more. We could now have a lifestyle that is green and that is smart and that is fair, and it could be a much more dematerialized type of thing, much more services, less products, much more rental, less possession, and so on. So that the change in lifestyles creates jobs, creates prosperity, the policies reverse inequality. There is a proactive state, a positive sum game between business and society. Those are the better times of capitalism. That's the Victorian boom, that's the Belle Epoque, that's the golden age, the post-war golden age, and hopefully we might have one ahead. So what determines what happens in these periods? Well, in installation, it's finance that sets the direction. In deployment, the government sets the direction. So we have to bring government back. The austerity, free market, whatever, doesn't work for deployment. It can work for deployment. And between the two, who sets the direction? Nobody. It's a rudderless time. It's a period when nobody knows which way to go. And that's precisely the moment when it's necessary to pick up and make the changes that will bring the golden age. So opportunities for catching up, which is different from what's happening in the North, which is what I have just described. I mean, it doesn't have to be the North, but that's where the advanced world has been. The opportunities for catching up will open or close depending on the period and on the nature of the technologies. So it's not by chance that groups of countries develop similarly in the same period. So we have the leap of US and Germany in 1870 to World War I. That was the maturity of the second revolution and the installation of the third. It was forging ahead, overtaking Britain, using tariff protection and subsidies. By the way, very high tariff protection. The US had an average of 60% tariffs. And subsidies all over, and the same thing in Germany. And that's how they leaped ahead. Then we have Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Chile in the same period, more or less. They were able to catch up. And there was increasing global demand for counter-seasonal food and raw materials. So when it was winter, it was, they had summer and winter, so you could have the counter-seasonal agriculture and minerals, of course, all the time. Then we have, in 1960 to 90, we had Japan and the four tigers making the leap. That was the maturity of the fourth and the installation of the fifth. So you have both the mass production things and microelectronics. That was the second globalization. So we see Japan rising to number 2, and then the four tigers catching up. Then we have in Latin America, import substitution. This was much earlier. This began, or more or less, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We had import substitution industrialization, and others in Asia were also doing the same. We had advances in development, producing for the domestic market under protection or for exports with subsidies. So we had a limited, but it was a very interesting and successful period for Latin America, even though many people don't want to recognize it. And China and India now, 1980 to date, the maturity of the fourth revolution, installation of the fifth. So at the same time, these three last things have happened more or less in this period. They have made the leap to the front with multifaceted state support, very complex state policies to do that. And opportunities come and go, and they are never identical. So it's no use copying past successes, but rather identifying the new trends and possibilities. So let's take a look at the combination of conditions that enabled import substitution industrialization in Latin America. In the world context, we had the first world with saturated markets and mature technologies. Latin America was interested in producing. And we had mature transferable technologies in the advanced world. So that created an opportunity for import substitution and the assembly industries, mainly for the domestic market, for reasons that have to do with the size, with the possible utilization of very large sizes of mass production plants. The local context, what was it? We had educated middle class with solvent demand, not too large, but enough. Governments with income from mono exports. So in fact, it was the mono exports, all the energy and copper and whatever other things we were exporting, that gave the state the capacity to be able to fund the process. And we had the possibility and the willingness to protect the domestic market, which was taken away during the 80s and 90s. So Latin America grew at an annual average of 4%, and some 8 and 9% in some cases, some countries. The middle class increased and a new working class emerged. Infrastructures were provided, a wider managerial layer development. So we're talking about a certain stage of development achieved, quite a few achievements, and a very important one. We acquired experience and knowledge in the processing industries. Not in the assembly industry. We were just, well, not. It was a complex process in management and organizing, and people who had never been workers before learned to do these things. But it was basically the final assembly. We didn't do any of the products ahead. So there was very little technological learning in there. But in the processing industries, that's different, because if we wanted to make tomato ketchup, we needed to take the tomatoes from the country with a different taste and a different conditions and maybe a different shape or whatever. We needed to change all sorts of things. The processing industries, which are chemistry, agroindustry, and all these things, they are basically industries which are not as simple as putting two things together with a screwdriver. So that's one thing that I would like you to note, because it has a lot to do with why we can take advantage of this combination, the new combination that we can now have. So the world context offers a globalized economy with Asia needing natural resources and Latin America with a big endowment. We have access to generic technologies, ICT, material science, biotechnology, etc., and to information in general. So we can think of an environmentally and socially sustainable opportunity. What's the local context? We have the legacy of import substitution in processing industries and services and in qualified personnel. So we can think of taking advantage of the opportunity. And we have the condition of hyper-segmented markets. We now have from commodity all the way to very specialized products, food. We have organic on the one end, and we have super special food, maybe all these things with insects and whatever new things you can have in food. the same thing with materials. So we have now access to global networks and platforms, and this means also the possibility of both the marketing through the internet and the commerce, not only the big containers, but also all the courier services. You can actually have very small products, very small quantities being transported at reasonable prices across the globe. And we have increasing requirements related to climate change and biodiversity. So these requirements actually create opportunities. So with adequate policies, it is possible to create an advanced and sustainable economy with high quality of life in both urban and rural areas. I will explain this when we come to the strategy. So let's go on to look at the opportunity in the second globalization with natural resources. First of all, I want you to note that there have been changing views on the role of natural resources in development. In the third revolution, in the age of steel and heavy engineering, it was considered a huge advantage. It was a major asset to favor and finance development. The US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, the Scandinavian countries, they were all funding and developing thanks to their natural resources. Even Germany, which had, of course, iron and coal and all this thing and agriculture. But in the deployment of the fourth revolution, in the age of mass production, it became a disadvantage. In the 1940s and 50s, increasing advantage goes to manufacturing industry, so that Prebisch and Singer write about the price scissors. So manufacturing industry prices were going up and all the natural resource prices were going down. Then we have the Dutch disease, which is another phenomenon, which was about how the prices of raw materials in the world economy was making it impossible for local industry to be competitive. And then we have the resource curse, which is all about corruption, which of course we cannot solve, but it doesn't mean that we can do nothing with the natural resources. So what could happen now? Could it be that the deployment of the fifth revolution, the age of information from the 2000s, have turned natural resources into an advantage? I would hold so. Let's look at our ideas about natural resources and what has changed. Prices, they're tending to increase due to limits. They went up very high, they came down, they're going to continue being volatile. That's not going to stop, but they will probably be volatile over a higher level. Corruption is going to continue being a problem. However, the nature of markets is changing substantially. Natural resources used to be only commodities. Now, with hypersegmentation, we have a long tail in products, in services, food, and materials. A long tail is that some products are commodities, but there are many, 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 many more products that are small markets, but very, very profitable, much more profitable than the commodities that have a very narrow margin. And in fact, many manufactured products and services have become commoditized. So it doesn't matter what you are. You're in the manufacturing world. Right now, televisions are a commodity. Even many of the things that have to do with the computer industry, how do you call them, the pen drives and all these things, all those things are commodities. They're manufactured, but they're still commodities. And of course, there are very special products at the other end. Every single market is now hyper-segmented. Demand grows. Okay, now there's going to be a very strong demand for natural resources in the emerging countries. And they need to feed the new millions reaching the middle class. And the Engels law, which said that as soon as people advance, they need less food, and mainly. Well, that will take even longer if full globalization occurs, which is a possibility. And even if it doesn't, there are still many millions of Chinese and Indians and Asians and so on coming into the market. Technological dynamism, it was always said, that they're not dynamic. Natural resources, all you do is make the process cheaper. Well, now it's much greater. It's enabled by information technologies, biotechnologies, and material science. It's propelled by the differentiation of demand from new producers and from those that are catering to the new sustainable lifestyles. So there is much more dynamism. Types of innovation, from improving processes to reduce costs and face peculiarities, which is what used to happen, to innovation in products. Even vegan and organic food requires innovation, even though it means that you're going to go back to the way it used to be. You've got to make it the way it used to be, but profitable and efficient. So we have multi-processes adapted to special demands with greater profit margins and possible entry barriers. We could get to the point where we are the ones who have patents. So when the context changes, we must change our ideas and also our policies. And the processing industries are no less industrial than the fabricating ones. I'm going to give you an idea. Processing industries with their innovation and operation networks are chemicals, biochemicals, custom materials, biomaterials, livestock, agriculture, hydroponics, agro-industries, new food, even insects, biotechnology, fisheries, aquaculture, forestry, paper, ceramics, glass, mining, metallurgy, packaging, biofuels, green hydrogen, refining, biorefining, electricity, renewables, nanotechnology, etc. And each includes commodities and a long tail of specialities. And all that has to be serviced by multiple engineering services, software and systems, capital goods, equipment and instruments, laboratory services, conservation and packaging, transport, marketing and distribution, technical service to users, market intelligence, R&D, patent lawyers, contract negotiation, training and education of specialized personnel, etc., etc. So it's a big, complex system with many directions in which it can go, and it has to do partly with the source, with the materials that we do have. Globalization, besides, under the environmental imperative, is going to require massive innovation in food, materials, and energy, and we can do it. Upgrading of the natural resources export mix with networks of innovation. Let's see how it could work. We have natural resource and basic processing industries, very often foreign, sometimes local, and they have their own export markets, and this has been going on forever and ever. Well, we can have local clusters of firms and or institutions that are doing knowledge-intensive services, research and production, who would connect with these natural resource producers and connect also with foreign firms and institutions of knowledge-intensive services, research and production. So there is this big world network that we can set up to create new additional specialized markets. So we improve the export mix. Some of the markets will be covered by the same previous ones, but changing their export mix, and some directly by these new, they can be called KIBs, like knowledge-intensive business services. I prefer to call them SKIs, small knowledge-intensive enterprises. So what we do is to take full advantage of new technology and of the hyper-segmentation of markets. Now, natural resources have to be seen in a systemic context, from relatively isolated production to a complex network aimed at innovation. It used to be that there were, like in some areas of the country where you have this isolated production things, very often with foreign companies that even had their own sort of living conditions. Now we can have a much more complex network, a much more complete industrializing thing, where we have natural resource production and we have the investment, including exploration, if it has to do with mining or oil, which of course we have to reduce and so on. That's part of the process which we have to enter. So then we have all the processing stages, then packaging, branding, etc., and transport, logistic, marketing, distribution. All this has to be done in a new technology-intensive way. And that needs to be fed by a whole set of companies, universities, institutes, public and private, that do equipment inputs, research development, and engineering and services. And the potential for innovative interactions in a natural resource-based network is not only large, it is very fast increasing. So let's look at an example of processes in a biorefinery. This is Porta, a biorefinery in Argentina, which gets fed with maize, sorgo, and soya. And it produces ethanol, it produces premix, soya, protein, glycerin, biodiesel, etc., etc. I mean, this very complex thing has to do with just agricultural inputs. So we have what they feed the salmon with is this soy protein concentrate, which also comes from this. So we're talking about processes where we might have 8 different products for sustainable animal food, materials, and fuel, some of them for human. It's a very complex set of possibilities, which of course has to do with which are the inputs that you're going to provide. But processing industries are peculiar. They have certain implications that are important to take into account. In most cases, they have high investment costs. So they need to consider financing, we need to consider financing strategies or alliances. In some cases, we also need a lot of knowledge because they use mainly skilled labor. So we need intense education and training efforts. Their raw materials from land and water involve specific environments. So we need to actively involve the communities affected so that they know what's going on and they're not, it's not against them. This is a very important thing that's now happening, which didn't happen with processing and with assembly industries. And they will not help reduce poverty directly. It's very little amount of, most of these things require not so much unskilled labor. So we need to develop a complementary strategy for the local economies. So let's see what that strategy would look like, a dual inclusive strategy. We're going to aim at 2 different and complementary goals: economic growth and global positioning, and full employment and well-being for all. 2 different and integrated ways of achieving them, establishing a dual strategy with differentiated policies and support networks. How would that be? I am proposing a dual integrated strategy for Latin America that will combine low and high tech employment, sustainable activities, and low and high tech companies. We'd have, on the one hand, the constantly upgraded production networks around natural resources, which are the engines of growth of the economy, and they would be using competitive technologies for global markets. On the other hand, we're going to have interconnected, specialized local economies all across the territory so that we have a differentiated development across the land in each part based on the local productive vocation identified and or promoted for local or global markets. So the idea is to keep people at home, keep people in the territory, no more going to the cities to turn it into slums and to suffer and to have informal economy and all these things. It's the opposite. We're going to create good life in the countryside. And that means, of course, internet and all sorts of other things, which I cannot discuss today. But it means rethinking development by stopping this idea that we have to create jobs in the cities and then attract the people to come to them. We can create wealth in every part of the territory. So the objective of these advanced things would be growth and generation of foreign exchange, but the objective, and of course the wealth of each of them, but as far as the state and the society is concerned, we get wealth that can be distributed. And then the objective of all these activities are to raise the quality of life of all inhabitants. And in between, we have an active state facilitating consensus and promoting local initiatives, creating the infrastructure, the funding, providing the funding, enabling institutions, and human capital, of course, very much. This has a lot to do with whether people are educated and trained to be able to do all these things. So that means also that we need different institutions in order to do this integrated dual strategy. We can't handle it with the same sort of Ministry of Industry. We need to have institutions that are to support and strengthen the engines of growth, which would be doing policy and political support, because very often it'll have to be international deals, long-term stable regulatory framework, negotiation. The stability of the regulatory framework is crucial, because they're going to be, when you're doing big investment in innovation, you need to know that the framework is going to be stable. Negotiations with governments, global companies, and communities. R&D, sorry, not I plus D in Spanish. Complementary R&D and great national projects, like Mariana Mazzucato is proposing as missions, so that you don't choose sectors, you choose missions, and you choose directions. So the direction in this case would be both green and natural resource technology. So it's all of them. And then you frame the different things with purposes, specific purposes in each case, like reduce plastics and this and that, or things of that sort. So actually reduce plastics by so much percentage and eliminate this and that and the other in very clear way. Missions are goals that are very clearly specified, as she explains. Specialized institutes and scholarships for studies abroad. Support in other aspects that would be identified by the leading firms. And we also need to have some form of consensus building institution that will make the private and the public sector work together. And then, on the other hand, for the other side of the dual strategy, the bottom-up part, we have an institutional framework to promote and give direct support to territorial development. That might mean that that the municipal governments become industrial strategy core institutions, where you have local wealth creation and high quality of life. So first of all, providing internet, technical and social infrastructure, a truly participatory model, identifying opportunities and niches for productive action, technical and financial support for developing businesses, the required innovations and the social organizations to develop them, and provide the training and the technical institutions required for the new local wealth creation initiatives. They will all be different, and the whole idea is to be able to strengthen in those areas where the projects have been identified. So each set of institutions would have different goals and capabilities, promoting diverse forms of public-private collaboration. I have had experience in the public sector, and I know that the type of work that one has to do with big companies and with little companies is so different that it's ridiculous to have the same people doing it. And that's what we've always had. The promise of this particular strategy, when taking paradigm shifts into account, is very important. It means that we can make a leap in development in 2 stages. We can first achieve growth now, taking advantage of the current window of opportunity for natural resource producers, while avoiding further slums and informality by improving life across the territory. So we are doing both. So we're creating the space and the conditions to prepare to make a leap in development with the next technological revolution, which is not that far away. It might be 20 years away, by developing capabilities, companies, and global networks in the sectors of the future, which are very likely to be biotech, nanotech, bioelectronics, and new materials. So that, in fact, is what Asia did without planning it with the ICT revolution. but it requires intense efforts in training, education, research, development, and engineering, and innovative cooperation at all levels and in all stages. So it's a very demanding sort of strategy. And it requires, of course, consensus, because if you don't have consensus, you don't do anything as complex as this. Now, can we take advantage of post-COVID reconstruction to make that leap? Well, successful national projects tend to follow a common pattern. What are they like? We start with an opportunity that's identified. You create the adequate institutions for promotion and support, increasing the technical capacity of government. This is like MITI in Japan. It's the sorts of things that the Tigers did. It's all, and it's also what we did when we made the leap with import substitution. Not only did we have institutions, we actually had a training center in Chile where the civil servants were trained by the thousands to learn how to handle all the complexities of import substitution. It was a very bureaucratic, rules-based thing, but it worked, and it worked well. At the end, it became just it became bureaucratic and heavy and all that, but that's what happens to everything. If things live beyond their useful lives, they become problematic. So you have these ambitious projects and objectives, and then we need managerial and technical human resources at various levels, technical and commercial alliances, and we also need finance, clear and favorable policies, and stable consensus. And you know, the drawing, the graph is not by chance. It's exactly, the opportunity holds the whole thing, but anything missing gets the thing out of balance. So we cannot pretend that it's going to be all state. We cannot, of course, pretend that it's going to be all private sector. Neither markets nor the state alone, but both following a consensus direction. And one of the reasons why we need the adequate institutions is because we need institutions that are capable of building that consensus so that we can actually go ahead with such a project. And it's important for us to note that globalization shapes the window of opportunity. Together, the extracting and processing industries have lagged in outsourcing and greening activities, but they are beginning to move, so it's a good moment to take advantage of that. The global specialized service companies are overstretched and not only will probably welcome the entry of local allies, but they're actually promoting them. There is no potential competitor that has gone far along this route. Africa, Russia, Kazakhstan could also do it because they also have natural resources, but I don't know what they have in terms of both the capabilities in that area or the disposition to do it. Anyway, we will be competing. We can't imagine that it's going to be without competition. And of course, Canada and Australia could be potential allies. And the pandemic has called the alert about two things. Environmental catastrophes, how do we face them? So that becomes a very important force for change, and the need for a more balanced globalization. So there is an opening for less globalization to Asia, more globalization more nearby, and that could open opportunities for us in terms of alliances. These are times for institutional innovation and for creating shared visions. The 1960s and 70s, we had the protectionist state. In the 1980s to date, we had the hands-off state, the free market world. From the 1920s, I believe we need to set up the promoting state. The pandemic is opening a new epoch. Post-COVID reconstruction, just as that after World War II, is likely to accelerate the changes in production methods, in sustainable lifestyles, and in policies that use them for development. So it's the moment to seize the opportunity. Let's not miss it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlota, for your lecture and your inaugural talk. Certainly, it's very refreshing to have an optimistic view in the circumstances. What I guess we're all feeling down, and your talk was also full of inspiration for the new generation. The idea that we have to think about a shared vision for the future and being more creative. We have about half an hour for questions. So please, if you want to ask questions, you can do it in two ways. You can either produce a question in the chat and I can read it out, or you can signal with the hand sign and I will call you, and then you can put your question live, but please be short if you come with your camera. Perhaps I can kick off with, just to keep the conversation rolling, and it's regarding your last point on globalization. It seems to me that the premise of your vision for the future is that we will continue with the globalizing trends, although you introduce a nuance at the end of your presentation. But of course, we have been reading a lot about the end of globalization, and I wanted to sort of press you on that. We have this sort of John Gray's essay in Prospect magazine saying this is the end of globalization. So I'd like you to sort of comment a little bit on that.
I didn't get that. The end of what?
The end of globalization. There is a lot of literature on the end of globalization. So I wanted, this is the premise of your talk, is that we will continue to live in a globalized world. So I just wanted you to comment and react to that.
Okay. Number one, globalization didn't have to be the way it was. The reason why we're going to have globalization, whether we like it or not, is because these technologies are globalizing by nature. You cannot, the whole of the information technology world, that's frontierless, and there's no way we're going to stop it. I don't know, maybe the Chinese will manage to make a separate, maybe there's going to be something that breaks up the internet into 3 bits. I don't know, maybe. That's very unlikely, I would say. But basically, what information technology has allowed is an actual global economy where companies can be unimaginable sizes, trade can be very easy, it has been facilitated in all sorts of ways, and therefore it's almost impossible to actually stop globalization. But what you can do is shape globalization and change it completely in its nature. It was very lopsided all to Asia, first of all. Secondly, destroying all sorts of things without thinking, worrying only about cost and not about resilience or strategy or any other criteria. It was just cost. And of course, what was happening was, on the one hand, that you were producing cheaper and cheaper and paying less and less to the workers and everybody in the advanced world, who were the ones who were going to buy these things. So the cheaper the things were, the more likely it was that salaries would not increase in the advanced world. So you created this inequality gap, helped by the fact that you had this incredible amount of low-cost labor available. This idea that Marx talked about, the reserve army of labor. Well, to have a country of hundreds of millions of people that was closed, and then it gets opened up, and then there you are. You have this incredible reserve army of labor that you didn't have before. That changed conditions so radically that people went they didn't think anymore. This was like a miracle that happened for businesses that were in mature technologies. Precisely, that's why we had import substitution, because they were no longer profitable. Labor in the advanced world wanted to increase salaries further, but productivity wasn't increasing anymore, because that's what happens at the end of a revolution. So this is the very complex situation that was created by the type of globalization. What could the new globalization look like? First of all, not so extreme, much more dispersed across the planet. Secondly, not so exclusive. Not excluding so many, because Africa and Latin America have been practically excluded from globalization, and the Middle East also, under all these wars and all these things that have made life. So practically globalization was Asialization mainly, and Chinalization. So that's one of the features. The other has to do with this possibility of not necessarily maintaining, I mean, China and some other countries are not going to have this incredibly low-cost labor that was also treated perhaps. I am reading now a book called Behemoth that describes how mass production was happening in China. One could have suspicion that that was it because we heard about the suicides and all that, but it's pretty horrendous. And that, of course, once you have transparency, then you don't have to have that. We have many other things that we have to have protection in some cases, because globalization doesn't mean what has been understood, which is that countries just open their borders and that's the end. Globalization means two very important things. One is that the economy is globalized, and therefore global corporations will choose where to put their bits. But the territory doesn't have to be globalized. Every country has to define where they want to go, what their purposes are, what things they will accept and which ones they won't. And this has to be somehow guaranteed by some form of, believe it or not, global government. Without global government, we have no governance of globalization, and without governance of globalization, problems like what we have now will happen. So we need also that. So long answer, but it was a very tough question because it includes many things.
Thank you. There are a few questions in the chat, but I want to bring first a couple of people who raised their hands at the beginning. Jose Maria Valenzuela. Jose Maria, if you want to unmute yourself and also show yourself so we can integrate you in the conversation.
Thank you. I'm Jose Maria. I'm a doctoral student at the Blavatny School of Government. And I want to ask you about the significance of regional strategies. And by regional, I mean multiple countries' strategies within Latin America, with the discussion of reshoring and regional specialization that has been occurring in recent times. I wonder whether these sub-regional, let's say Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, the certain parts of the Southern Cone would make sense of to drive the discussion forward.
Okay, first of all, even though I'm talking about Latin America as a whole, I'm not imagining that we're going to have a board of something, you know, to make a regional Pan-American whatever. I think if we all do the same thing, according to our own conditions, every country can do it, and then in the end we have connections. But I also think something much crazier. I think we need to set up OPEX in every single raw material, in every single, you know, producers of whatever. We have to do what the Germans did when they made their forging ahead policy. What they did was to actually legally promote cartels. Even when the companies didn't do it, the government would force them to do it. Because there was a problem at the time for the Germans. It was that the prices were going down because of globalization, and their companies were risking disappearance, and that meant all sorts of problems. So they legally forced their companies to form cartels, and it was fantastic. It strengthened the industry. It made them work together, made them research together, banks helped them together. And that's how Germany managed to create very powerful industries in all the sectors where they had these cartels. Of course, this whole OPEC story, which I don't know if you people know, it's the most successful fake news in history. The OPEC price was not set by OPEC countries. And that I know because I'm a Venezuelan, and I heard it, not only that I read it, but that I heard it from Perez Alfonso, who was the founder of OPEC, actually, the one who proposed it and everything. It was proposed by the US and it was pushed on OPEC by the US and the oil companies. The oil companies needed to exploit the North Sea and all sorts of expensive sources. They no longer had cheap oil. And the US was facing competition from Germany and Japan, who were oil importers, and they had a very bad deficit in their balance of payments. So this, which is something that nobody believes and nobody knows, is the truth. But you know, fake news, when it becomes accepted, you can't break it. Now, the thing is that cartels have become this horrible thing. I think we need cartels. It's the only way to do the green economy. We've got to make the prices of raw materials be very high so that we can dematerialize the economy, so that people will innovate reducing materials, so they will innovate turning products into services, and so that the producers of raw materials can receive higher unit prices for less material, because we need to help reduce materials. So if we are going desperately to sell cheap materials because we need, otherwise we don't have incomes with which to develop, the advanced world should not only accept, but promote. And it should be organized in an international something, so that every set of producers will be able to raise the prices, so that innovators will reduce them, and we need the recycling. I mean, the whole green economy requires high prices of raw materials. The case with food is different, but anyway, it's too long to discuss. But definitely in terms of materials, we need to do things like that. So that means it's not just Latin America. We'll have to be together with Africa, you know, like OPEC. It's wherever you are. If you produce that particular material, you get together and you decide how much each one will produce and what the prices will be. And even with discussion with the consumers, because it can be done in a planned way. So, I mean, that's as far as I would even want to go, but not necessarily to imagine that we're going to have a Latin American board of industrialization or something. Just that much.
Well, thank you, Carlota. We have next a student in our program, Maria Pulakainen. Maria.
Much for your excellent talk. Inspired. Some positivity.
No, we are not listening to you.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? So thank you, Carlota, for an inspiring talk. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you about consensus building in particular, when you talked about your dual integrated strategy. I'm feeling a bit skeptical as to why governments that at the moment don't have territorial reach across their borders or across their entire land territories, how they would now be incentivized to interconnect these specialized local economies after decades of failing to do so.
Well, I would say that most of the local economies are not very successful. And therefore, both the brain drain, because people go to the city, all the young people, the active people, anybody who wants to have a good life leaves. So, you have the whole of the territory left to the ones who stay, the old, the violent, the ones, there are many terrible things that are happening. And I think the cause, the problem is it's like eating its own tail. Because you don't have a good conditions of living in the countryside, then people don't stay, it doesn't grow, there is no peace because there are these terrible conditions too. So there is, the process has to be done by steps and by regions. Of course, it depends how you change. The local governments are generally among the least capable because they don't have very much to do, and also perhaps a bit corrupt, if not a bit corrupt. So but you know, corruption is also the result of, that's the only way in which I can live well. You know, if you have an alternative, if there is something else that's going on, I was thinking even that the way to do this is to have like a military service, but a development service, so that people who graduate would voluntarily work for a year or two, setting up wealth creating units, businesses in the territory, learning, having a course of 3 months or so, learning everything you need to know in order to identify markets, in order to set up companies, in order to get funding, you know, everything. So you're experts, you go there to each of those things. And when people have spent a year or two doing that, when they come out, they'll be entrepreneurs themselves, because they now know everything you need to know in order to set up something. So it could also have a double result. So it's, you know, I told you that in order to do import substitution, thousands of people were trained in how to do it. We need to understand that if we're going to do something like this, it means training thousands of people. This is, it's both to do the high-tech things and to do the others. And to be willing to spend both the money and the effort in doing that and creating the institutions. So, of course, you know, on the one hand, I think it's a complete dream, because Latin America now is chaos. The left has committed suicide by supporting Maduro, the criminal government that presents itself as socialism. I don't know how anybody can support that, thinking that it's socialism or anything, but the left has done it, and they are absolutely embarrassing. And the right has gotten married with the free market, completely incapable of understanding that peace and advance for themselves cannot happen if they don't improve the country. So somehow the middle is empty. We need to bring something to the middle. We need to bring intelligence and understanding. We need to bring the best people to get together and start and stop this crazy, these suicidal extreme positions in Latin America. I think that is our biggest problem now, is precisely that nobody knows what to do, because they both have these useless ideas of pure state and pure market. And they're both useless. They haven't proved. There is nowhere in the world where success has been done by either one or the other. It's always been the two.
We have a few questions in the chat. So before I bring Marianne, who also raised her hand, let me then go to the chat. There is a question by Sebastian Rafael, one of our new students. If there are other alternatives to neoliberal globalization, and I hope that we still have another 20 minutes, and I hope to bring everyone in. Yes, I repeat the question. If there are other alternatives to neoliberal globalization, would it be possible to think of a more Keynesian globalization with increased national sovereignty in economic policy and with more safety nets?
Absolutely. That's what I was saying. We need to be able to use protection. We need to be able, of course, there is one problem with the Keynesian. If you talk about the global notion of Keynes, about the economy having to do with demand and all these things, great. But the mechanisms are very difficult, because you can no longer think of economies as this hydraulic thing where you play the interest rate against against employment and so on. This sort of thing wouldn't work. And if Keynes were alive, he would already have thought up what to do. But definitely what we need is a globalization where protection is possible, where agreements between countries can be not this absurd thing that, this fanatical free market, which has failed. I mean, it is obvious that the world is much more violent. Peace in all sorts of places is difficult. Poverty, inequality has created resentment, has created populism. So to continue along that path within countries and between countries is absolutely mad. So yes, we need this other option.
We have now another question from our colleague Celia Susterman. We know what needs to be done and praise the presentation, but once again, all this needs is a new type of leadership and political will. Can such leadership be identified in Latin America?
Political will and what else?
Political will and leadership. Can such leadership be identified in Latin America? I suppose, where do you see that Latin America, or adding to footnote to Celia's question, where do you see in Latin America people taking your advice?
Okay, first of all, I think that a lot of people have turned their back on politics because it's disgusting, because they don't see anything that could be done. Many intelligent people would rather become entrepreneurs, would rather become anything but a politician. The first thing we need to do is to propose a politics that people are attracted to, that competent and real leaders and could be attracted to. So that's one first thing. We're also losing a lot of human capital, leaving our countries because there is nothing to be done. There is this lack of hope. So we need to actually work to bring the proposals on the table. If they are convincing, there will be people that will be interested, and then we could have, because right now the only thing is this populist thing about taking from the rich and giving to the poor, or the other extreme, because of course they're both populist, the super extreme right, that's a la Bolsonaro sort of thing. We need to provide something to hold on to, something to believe in, something that we want to do, and then we will have the leadership. Otherwise, it's not going to come. I think people have given their back to politics.
So let me bring now Marianne Jimenez, former student of us and now a postdoc at the center. Marianne.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Carlota. So great to see you again. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very inspiring. I actually was going to ask about consensus as well, but now that you've answered that, I want to press you a little bit on the time question. So we know that building consensus, and in the midst of this political crisis, among many other crises in Latin America, it's going to be hard and it's going to take time. So when I was looking at your marvelous presentation, I just thought, when is this going to happen? And how much time do you have in mind for this process to actually capitalize? I know it's a tough one, and it's always hard to predict, but that was my first one. And the second one, I want to press you as well on the actors, right? So when you say we need to put this on the table, who do you have in mind? Do you think that society, global society or civil society should be part of this? Because I agree that the leadership is, sort of convoluted with many other issues right now in Latin America, to put it simply. So I wonder who is going to take this this process into the hand, this transformation, and actually, push for it and make it happen. Thank you.
Okay, how long will it take? It could be done in 20 years. Think of internet. We've only had internet since '94. In 26 years, we've come this far. So change in societies happens in a can happen in a very rapid way. So I imagine that we could have in 20 years the things coming, and some countries further ahead, some countries further behind, some countries actually showing the way, and then people wanting to copy those countries. You can only copy when the opportunity is still there. So if somebody does it, it is copyable still. We cannot copy Korea, but we can copy somebody who might do this. So the first thing is it accelerates once it takes off, and it takes off very slowly. So it could take 6 years to take off and 20 years to actually be looking strong. Now, who are these people who have to put this on the table? Normally, each of these things happen with new political parties, not, or breakaways from the existing political parties, and then you get new things. And those new things that happen generally come from new sort of goals. So it could be that the green revolution thing could bring young people and people who are not so young, plus the information revolution, plus because this is based a lot on a lot of science and technology being incorporated, that perhaps we could have this civil society sort of thing that might create political movements that might, in the end, depending on what they offer. Also, there could be lots of things happening before the government changes in terms of this local transformation. There can very well be people who go and organize communities to make them produce things. It's so easy to sell, even in places like, you can export things to Japan, to Germany, to whatever, relatively easily if you have something special. And the whole thing of identifying something special and being able to keep people could be one of the ways of starting to show that it's possible. Showing that it's possible is one of the things that's necessary. And that depends on whether some people will try it out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point in terms of without opening the idea of possibilities, then we get into fatalism. Now, there is a question from Sarah Sapico. How do you propose countries reform their political institutions to make them more stable and in the meantime attract foreign investment?
Oh, well, this is all like bit by bit. Every bit counts. There are some bits that can begin before. We cannot bring foreign investors while we have chaos. I mean, there are countries that can't bring foreign investors at all, like Venezuela, which is total chaos. But there are some other countries. I mean, Argentina is half chaos. So, we need some countries like Uruguay, for instance, which is not chaotic at all, to perhaps do some of the things. I think I got lost with the question, thinking about, yes, now I got it. So foreign investment can only be brought to those places where some stability is more or less guaranteed. So that's one of the things that cannot happen. But even local investors, for local investors to want to actually enter into anything that's big enough, that's worthwhile, they have to have some form of guarantee that there will be stability in the regulatory framework, and that's very difficult. So, there are many obstacles, but there have always been many obstacles. All successful things have happened against obstacles. So the question is, could something like this, understanding the opportunity, because the opportunity is there, it is real, it is very wide-ranging, it has space for everybody, really. So if the opportunity is recognized and it begins to be taken up by some people in small places, by some countries, by some investors, and you see huge success, and there are already quite a few successes in say this slide that I showed you about this company that's doing BIOREFINERY. It's quite successful. There is a company exporting a cooperative in a small place in Argentina that's exporting organic honey to Europe with great success. There are other companies in various places, the B corporations that are doing all sorts of things also in that. So you have little, and that's how it all happens. You have little examples, but you need to make people know about them. Not everything is known. So you start, the people who believe in this, start moving, start putting the information on the table, letting people know that this is possible, demanding that politicians understand that things cannot continue the way they are, and so on. It's a big, big process, which of course maybe academics have only a very small role to play, but it's a very important role, which is to either do the science and technology stuff or do the information and the understanding and the explanation of what's being proposed. So that's one. But people who become entrepreneurs themselves, or people who become politicians, they have another role, and all those things come together. And then possibly we can get to where we could aim for.
Our next question comes from one of our new students, I think, Jan Contreras. Thank you very much for the talk. Doesn't a change in paradigm and in production strategy organization need extensive human capital and the highly educated workforce? Do certain Latin American nations which lack these elements have a chance at seizing the post-COVID reconstruction?
Well, we lack it and we don't. We have quite a few. Most countries have quite a few people who are underemployed and who are overqualified, because we have had so many people studying abroad and having experience abroad. And those people in the diaspora also help. The Chinese diaspora helped enormously in what they did. So we have many Latin Americans all over the US and Europe, all over the world, who are extremely competent. And if we start really moving things, they will either work from abroad or they will come back and they will come to the countries, because most people who are sort of exiled would love to come back, but not if you're going to go to some boring something that's worthless. You want to come back to do something worthwhile. And that is the feeling of most people that are abroad, except, of course, if you have children who have become already so, so attached because all their friends and their language and everything, then people who are already with teenage or with teenage children find it very difficult to come back. But they can they can serve this diaspora contacts, they can become representatives, they can, there are many things that can be done by turning the diaspora into a force, and the whole of the Latin American diaspora could actually become a very strong support sector.
I hope to be able to bring back colleagues or students who have already asked questions, but I want to bring also people who have not been able to come to the fore. And there is a comment from Jasmine Duarte, former student who is now in Germany. So please, I invite you to read it. But there is also a question for Luisa Wagner. Jasmine says, definitely important to think about future within the framework of sustainability and the limits imposed by the climate crisis challenge. Thanks for the presentation. And Luisa Wagner asks, she was wondering, how do you see the role of China with its ongoing investment strategy, and whether the promoting state does necessarily have to be the respective Latin American country for its domestic industries? To what extent do you anticipate China's influence increasing through this?
Okay, first of all, China is one of the biggest clients for exports of whatever special materials or whatever we would do. China and the West are both interested in our resources, whether they are just the raw ones or if we can upgrade them. So if we were smart enough, we would play the West against China and China against the West. We would actually decide what we want, and we would start working with them, negotiating. That's one of the roles that I think the state could play to help the advanced companies, that we could, sort of play one against the other until we get what we want. And whoever gives us what we want, well, that's what who we're going to go with. So I think that's one of the elements, one of the things that could happen. I think probably, unfortunately, I think the US is declining. And I hope Trump doesn't win. If he wins, I'm sure it will decline. There's no way it can be saved. So that weakens the position of the West. Hopefully, he will lose. and it'll be difficult to pick up because it's as everywhere, like Latin America. It's very strange because what's happening with populism everywhere is this extreme positions that divide countries, and somehow they empty the middle, which is where we have to be. And so, yes, I think the difficulties that we now have because of the confrontation with China and because of the not so clear goals that China has with the Belt and Road Initiative, which could be wonderful, but it reminds one of what the British did in the empire, building all the railways and all that in order to get the minerals out of the mines and out into the sea and onto the ships and back to their country, and somehow not necessarily worrying about developing the country behind that. So it is a complex situation. We have to still observe. It could be that China could play a good role, financing, funding, helping, if they accept that for them, it's very important that the whole world should develop. And it's the same thing that the advanced world should understand, that if the whole world develops, they will have markets for their capital goods, for their technologies. They will have allies. They will have possibilities. It's not like with mass production, where their main interest was to have low-cost raw materials so that they could have expensive labor and low-cost raw materials, and still, the sort of dependency situation where the developing world could not develop because it was not in the interest of the advanced world is over. Now it could be very much in their interest. It could have, that was one option of my talk that I didn't develop, but maybe you can read some of my papers if you're interested in that aspect.
Thank you, Carlota. We are running out of time, but we may have time for a couple of last two questions. And I want to bring in my colleague, Diego Sanchez Ancochea. He is responding to a previous comment by Celia Susterman. And Celia said, I promoted conglomerates and see where we are today. Diego responds, as much as I agree with Celia's message about the difficulties of finding political leadership related to her previous comments, I'm not so sure if he agrees with her views on ISI. It was a period of highest growth, and as Alice Amsden's The Rise of Rest shows, it was a period of significant transformation in the global South. We can learn a lot about what worked and what didn't. The question is what to learn from a different moment in history. Maybe we can think about the structure of the state a little more. How can we build a different state? Where would you start? That's an easy one.
You won't believe me, but I understood about 50%. I have tinnitus, which is something that...
Right, okay, the question is, in a way, can we think about the structure of the state a little more? How can we build a different state? Where would you start?
Oh, super different. One of the biggest problems that the advanced countries have is that they have not rethought their state. And that includes the welfare state, that includes all the policies, the way that policies are made, the way democracy works. There are all sorts of problems that these countries have, and we have even more, because we never really developed a sort of, well, let's leave at what we didn't develop. We need, first of all, to make government attractive to really competent people who want to change things. We need to organize government in such a way that people will be like in the most modern corporations, where people are creative, where they get an opportunity to actually change things, where you connect directly with the people. Government services should be like Amazon, really simple. You just do one click, this super bureaucratic, super heavy, super demanding, which becomes also a corrupt thing. It's terrible. But then the more important things, the possible institutions, the new institutions that would have to deal with serious development processes in each of the areas where this has to happen, it has to be completely different. Even, CONICIT, all those organizations that were promoted by UNESCO in the 1970s, that every single Latin American country set up, have made the separation between the scientists and the producers. They always talk about a bridge, but there was never a bridge. In fact, the reason why I worked in government, I proposed that we should have inside the Ministry of Industry, we should have a technological development directorate so that we could make companies become technology conscious and develop technology themselves, and therefore have the other side of the bridge, otherwise than just the cantilever. So even that, we have those conceived things have to be divided into one, just education, science, all that, and the other, truly technology and industry technology and agriculture technology and natural resources or whatever. You know, we have to think of how to get it together. We have to bring, for everything, we need to bring groups where we have everything. We have business, finance, technology, the workers, communities to participate in all these things. We need radical changes, but for that, we have to go little by little. That's the whole problem. How long does it take? If we don't start, it's forever. If we start, it could be short or long, depending on how many join and how clear the whole thing becomes for more people.
Well, I'm sorry to have to bring this to a close, but there is one last question, and I think we finish here. It's from Alex Leroy. And the question is, for this upcoming new globalization, do you think we will see a multi-speed Latin America? A country like Venezuela doesn't seem ready to have a promoting state without a political shift and might be left behind. This would widen the already existing gap.
Well, I think that has nothing to do with what proposals we might have. The gap is horrible. I mean, it's the destruction of a country. I don't know how it can be. I mean, that's it. Let's not talk about Venezuela, because Venezuela is a tragedy. I mean, it is a tragedy. It's a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Nobody could have invented it. Nobody could have believed that for 20 years a country could be going into disappearance. There's nothing. The poor are now 97%. They used to be a lot. It used to be 50%, 40%. Now it's 90%. It's horrendous. So let's not talk about that. But there is still, excluding Venezuela, there are differences. And I think it would be nice if we could think of some form of collaboration between the countries in order to, we have tried with the Andean Pact, we have tried with the, to try to strengthen each other with the Cono Sur, I can't remember what it's called. So yes, we have tried to do these things, but I would say that it would be great if it happened, but sometimes we have wanted to make these Latin American whatever, and we've created some bureaucracies that are so heavy and so useless that I'm not sure that that's the route. I think we first pick up bits and things and so on, and ask, this paradigm, this information technology paradigm, teaches us something very important, and it allows us to do something very important, which is you do a pilot study. And if it's good, you multiply it. And if it's not good, that's the end of it. So you have this sort of, you can have platform things, and you create the platform, and then you have a few, and you see how it works. And if it works, it goes, and then it grows. Otherwise, it doesn't grow. And I think we need to work bit by bit, recognizing the peculiarities of things, because just as markets have hyper-segmented, governments have to hyper-segment. We need to have governments that are local, then semi-local, then up further, then national, then supranational, and possibly global. And that is how big corporations now function. They function with many levels. And we need to copy. Every time, every technological revolution has created first a model of management in countries, in big companies, and then it's copied by the government. And I think that is a very important lesson for us to now see how we could change both the purpose of the government, the way it's organized, the way it works, the way it relates to people, the institutions that are there, and so on. It's a very, very big job. And, and we don't have enough people wanting to do that. People sort of escape from this horrendous job. But it's a wonderful job that we could all want to do if there were enough of us starting, and if things were starting to move and it looked like we could do it. I want to tell you, since we're going to end, that in my webpage, carlotaperez.org, there is an address. And normally, especially for students, I'm always available. The only thing is, if you ask something that I can answer with 2 sentences or 3 sentences, I will do it immediately. If you ask something that's very complex and needs more than that, I will tell you how long it'll take for me to answer, and I have a list of pendings, and sometimes it can take 2 weeks, sometimes 5 days, sometimes 2 months, but I will always reply. So
Thank you very much, Carlota. That's very generous and very kind. And on that note, I'm really sorry to have to bring this to a close. It was very inspirational. You brought us energy. I think when one thinks about a model of inaugural lecture, the sort of thing that we have in mind for our new students and our institute and our center, I think that was a model of inaugural lecture. I think it was interdisciplinary. You brought in history and elements of social sciences and technology and policy making. So you couldn't get more interdisciplinary than that. And of course, the most important thing is that you convey a message of optimism at these very difficult times for everyone, certainly for Latin America, but also for all of us in our global community. A message also of inspiration for our students who need to be encouraged to think about the future in terms of possibilities. And so for that, we are really very appreciative of your time with us. And I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of the students and on behalf of my colleagues and of the friends of the Latin American Center who join us today. I'll invite you to continue coming to our seminars. The next seminar will be the history seminar on Thursday. We'll be talking about feminism and Pan-Americanism. And we'll have 2 at the Zulia with the former student Mark Patterson talking to about a recent book on the topic. And we'll reconvene the main seminar next Tuesday. So if you want to show your faces or turn on your microphone to give a round of applause to Carlota. In different circumstances, we'll have a glass of wine. We hope to have that in the future. Thank you so much, Carlota. That was great.
Thank you, Eduardo.